I work as a night nurse in a small hospital on the outskirts of town. It's usually a quiet shift, mostly tending to a few elderly patients or those recovering from surgery. But one night, something happened that I can't explain, and it's haunted me ever since. It was around 2 a.m. when I got a page about a new patient being admitted to Ward C, the quietest section of the hospital, reserved for patients requiring special monitoring. The thing is, I hadn't heard anything about a transfer, and there was nothing in our system to suggest a new patient was coming in that night. But I headed to Ward C anyway, assuming it was a clerical error. When I reached the ward, I saw a figure lying in room 105. My stomach tightened when I realized the room lights were already on, dim but enough to cast long, eerie shadows across the bed. The patient was a man, around 40 or so, with pale, gaunt features. His face was angular, almost skeletal, and his eyes were sunken, closed in a deep, unnatural stillness. His hair was dark and messy, as if he'd been sleeping for days without moving. There were no monitors hooked up to him, no chart at the end of his bed. Nothing to indicate why he was there or what had happened to him. Confused, I stepped closer and gently shook his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" He didn't respond, and his skin felt strangely cold. I checked for a pulse, half expecting not to find one, but there it was, steady, though disturbingly faint. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, and as I looked at him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow wrong. I went back to the nurse's station and tried to look him up in the system. But when I typed in room 105, nothing came up. No patient file, no history, nothing. I checked again, entering every possible variation of his name that might be linked to the bed, but the screen just flashed, no records found. I tried calling my supervisor, but the call went straight to voicemail. By now, the whole situation was starting to make me uneasy. I debated whether to call security, but I decided to give it one more try and went back to the room. When I entered again, I froze. The man was now sitting up, staring straight ahead. His eyes were wide open, dull and unfocused, as if he weren't really looking at anything at all. His lips moved slightly, as though he was whispering something, but I couldn't make out any sound. I stepped closer, fighting the impulse to turn and leave. "Sir, are you all right?" His eyes shifted, finally focusing on me, and a chill ran down my spine. His gaze was empty, almost as if he were looking through me. I don't know how to explain it, but his eyes seemed to carry something dark, something void of humanity. "Where am I?" he murmured, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "You're in the hospital," I replied. "Do you remember what happened?" He tilted his head slightly, his mouth twitching in a faint, unsettling smile. "I don't remember." I asked his name, but he just stared at me, his eyes narrowing as if I'd asked a question that didn't make sense. He repeated that he didn't remember and sank back down into the bed, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. I backed out of the room, feeling as though I'd interrupted something I shouldn't have. Once again, I returned to the nurse's station and tried to find anything about room 105 or any sign of recent admissions to Ward C. But again, nothing. It was as though he didn't exist. Then I checked the room assignment for Ward C and felt my stomach drop. According to the system, room 105 had been marked unassigned for months. No patients, no staff records, nothing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was some kind of mix-up, a record-keeping error. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew that didn't make sense. How had he gotten there? And who admitted him? I decided to do a final round of the ward before morning, partly to reassure myself that he was just an ordinary patient. But as I reached the door of room 105, I stopped. The bed was empty. The sheets were rumpled, as though someone had been lying in them, but the man was gone. I searched the room, checked the bathroom, even looked out into the hallway, but there was no trace of him. He had vanished. I reported it to my supervisor when she arrived in the morning. She gave me a strange look, as if she thought I was making it up. "Room 105 is empty," she said firmly. "It has been since the beginning of this month." But I saw him, I insisted. He was right there. He even spoke to me. My supervisor sighed, then handed me an old file, yellowed with age. "We don't use that room," she said quietly. "Not since the incident." The incident turned out to be a tragic accident that happened years ago. A patient, a man in his 40s, had been admitted with a rare neurological condition. He was there for a few weeks, gradually declining, until one night he just stopped. He was found sitting up in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, and completely unresponsive. They pronounced him dead shortly after. But there were rumors that even after he'd passed, people claimed they'd seen him sitting up in the bed, staring into space, as though he were waiting for something or someone. Over the years, other staff reported seeing him in room 105, particularly on quiet nights. He'd appear, lying in the bed, or sometimes sitting up, muttering to himself. No one ever knew why, and the stories became one of those legends staff would whisper about on the night shift. My supervisor looked at me with a sympathetic but firm expression. Room 105 is empty. Always has been. Now get some rest. I nodded, though I could tell she didn't believe me. That night, I left the hospital and tried to put the whole incident out of my mind. But as I walked to my car, I felt a strange heaviness, like someone was watching me. I turned, glancing back at the hospital windows, and froze. There, on the third floor, was the faint outline of a figure. Even from a distance, I recognized him. His sunken eyes, his hollow stare, that faint, unsettling smile. He watched me for a moment, then lifted a hand in a slow wave, his eyes empty and dark as shadows. I turned and bolted to my car, driving away as fast as I could. The next day, I asked to be reassigned to a different ward. I still work nights, but I never set foot near Ward C, and I never go near room 105. Yet sometimes on those long, lonely nights, I'll glance up toward the third floor, toward the window where I saw him last. And I swear sometimes I see him there, staring down, waiting patiently for his next visitor.